History often appears inevitable when viewed from a distance. Empires rise and fall, armies advance, cities collapse, and centuries later it feels as though events could not have unfolded any other way. Yet history is shaped not only by forces and numbers, but by moments of decision, moments when the future balances on the resolve of individuals who refuse to accept what seems unavoidable. In the autumn of 1177, the Kingdom of Jerusalem stood at precisely such a moment. The kingdom was young and fragile, surrounded by stronger powers and weakened by internal divisions. Its borders were thinly defended, its resources limited, and its people exhausted by years of constant threat. To many outside its walls, Jerusalem's survival was temporary, a relic awaiting erasure. Even within the kingdom, few truly believed it could endure another major invasion. The sense of impending loss was everywhere, spoken in whispers, written in private letters, and visible in the anxious eyes of its leaders. At the center of this uncertainty stood a king who was never meant to rule for long. Baldwin IV had shown signs of illness from an early age. What began as numbness in his hands soon revealed itself as a slow, irreversible disease that would steadily weaken his body. Physicians offered no cure and little hope. In an age that equated physical strength with authority, Baldwin's condition marked him as a ruler whose reign would be brief and whose legacy was already questioned. Despite this, Baldwin was crowned king while still a teenager. His coronation brought ceremony, but no illusion. Every noble in Jerusalem understood the truth. This was a kingdom ruled by borrowed time. The real question was not how long Baldwin would live, but whether Jerusalem itself could survive long enough to outlast him. As Baldwin grew older, his condition worsened. His hands weakened, his legs failed him, and pain became a constant companion. Yet, while his body declined, his mind sharpened. Unable to rely on physical strength, he studied maps, memorized terrain, and listened carefully to seasoned commanders. He understood something many overlooked, that leadership did not depend solely on the strength of one's body, but on clarity of purpose and strength of will. Beyond Jerusalem's borders, a far greater force was gathering. To the south and east, a powerful Muslim leader had succeeded where others had failed. He united rival factions, disciplined vast armies, and directed them toward a single goal. His reputation alone caused cities to hesitate and garrisons to surrender. By 1177, his forces were no longer testing the boundaries of Crusader territory. They were prepared to erase it. Scouts returning to Jerusalem that autumn brought grim reports. A massive army was moving north, well supplied and confident. This was not a raid or a warning strike. It was an invasion meant to end the kingdom. The numbers were overwhelming, and the intent was unmistakable. If this force reached Jerusalem unopposed, the city would not withstand it. Fear spread through the capital. War councils grew tense and somber. Maps were spread across stone tables, but no strategy offered reassurance. The city's defenses were thin, its garrison small, and its allies distant. Some advisors spoke of negotiation, others of retreat. A few suggested preparing for a siege, though all understood such preparations would likely fail. Unspoken among them was a question no one wished to ask aloud. Should the king be removed from the city to preserve the crown, even if the kingdom fell? From a practical standpoint, it was reasonable. A living king could inspire future resistance, a dead one could not. Yet the idea hung heavy in the chamber, uncomfortably close to betrayal. When Baldwin was carried into the council chamber, silence followed. Frail and visibly weakened, he nevertheless commanded attention. He listened patiently as his advisor spoke, weighing each argument without interruption. When they finished, he asked to be raised. The effort was painful, but his voice, when it came, was steady and calm. "I was not crowned to flee," Baldwin said. There was no anger in his words, only resolve. He reminded them that waiting would change nothing. If the enemy arrived intact, Jerusalem would fall regardless. Retreat would only delay the inevitable. Resistance, however desperate, was the kingdom's only chance to shape its own fate. That night, Jerusalem prepared not for siege, but for movement. Orders were issued, supplies gathered, and horses readied. At dawn, instead of sealing its gates, the kingdom marched out to meet the storm. A small force assembled, knights hardened by years of war, infantry drawn from towns and villages, men who understood the odds and came anyway. Baldwin rode at their head, secured to his saddle, his failing body hidden beneath armor and cloth. Those who saw him that morning later recalled the same impression. He did not look like a dying boy. He looked like a king who had already accepted his fate and chosen action over fear. The march that followed defied expectation. The distance was long, the terrain unforgiving, and time was dangerously short. Yet the pace never slowed. Men pushed beyond exhaustion, driven not by confidence, but by necessity. Every mile gained increased risk, but also shortened the enemy's time to react. While the Crusader force advanced, the opposing army remained unaware. Confident in its superiority, it had spread out across the countryside. Discipline relaxed, foraging parties wandered freely, and battle formations were neglected. Victory seemed inevitable, and inevitability breeds carelessness. As dawn rose on the day that would decide everything, Baldwin's scouts returned with news that cut through fatigue like fire. The enemy was not prepared. It was not assembled for battle. It was vulnerable. For the first time, hope entered the ranks, not as certainty, but as possibility. The kingdom that was supposed to die had arrived not as a retreating shadow, but as a challenge. Baldwin closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in resolve. The impossible no longer seemed unimaginable.
As the army moved deeper into enemy territory, the physical strain of the march became impossible to ignore. Armor grew heavier with every mile. Horses foamed and stumbled, driven beyond what most commanders would ever dare demand. Men who had fought for years felt exhaustion settle into their bones. Yet the march did not slow. It could not. Every step forward was a wager against time itself. At the center of the column rode Baldwin. His body was failing him, but his presence held the army together. He spoke little, conserving strength, yet his determination was unmistakable. Knights who might otherwise have questioned the plan found their doubts silenced by the sight of a king who endured without complaint. If he could continue, they reasoned, so could they. Pain followed Baldwin constantly. His hands, wrapped to protect damaged flesh, could barely grip the reins. His legs had lost much of their strength, forcing attendants to secure him to the saddle. Every jolt sent sharp reminders of his condition through his body, yet he did not turn back. He had long accepted that his life would be short. What mattered now was what he chose to do with the time he had. The men around him sensed this. Baldwin was not marching to preserve himself. He was marching because he believed the kingdom still had a chance. That belief mattered more than numbers, more than fatigue, more than fear. Morale, fragile as it was, began to harden into resolve. As hours passed, the march took on a strange rhythm. Exhaustion stripped away hesitation. There was no room left for doubt, only forward motion. The army became quieter, more focused. Men conserved their breath, their thoughts fixed on the unknown ahead. Each mile carried them closer to an encounter no one could truly predict. Meanwhile, the opposing army advanced with very different expectations. Confident in its size and reputation, it moved without urgency. The land provided plentiful resources, and discipline loosened as victory seemed assured. Scouts reported little resistance. Jerusalem, they believed, was too weak to challenge such a force in the open. This assumption shaped every decision that followed. Rather than maintaining tight formations, units spread out across the countryside. Commanders allowed foraging and rest, expecting no immediate threat. Supplies were plentiful, spirits high. The campaign felt less like a battle and more like a procession toward inevitable success. It was this imbalance between desperation and certainty that Baldwin recognized as opportunity. By late morning, the Crusader scouts returned with critical information. The enemy host was vast, but disorganized. Its strength lay in numbers, not readiness. The army was stretched across miles of open ground, its units disconnected, its defenses relaxed. This news passed quietly through the ranks, lifting tired heads and sharpening tired eyes. This was not victory, but it was something just as rare, a chance. Baldwin listened carefully to every report. Though weakened in body, his mind was precise. He understood that this moment would not last. Once the enemy realized what was happening, their numbers would overwhelm any advantage. The only option was speed, surprise, and absolute commitment. There could be no hesitation. As the army paused briefly to regroup, some knights glanced toward Baldwin, wondering whether he would lead from a safer position. His condition alone justified caution. Yet when the order came, it erased any doubt. The king would ride with the front ranks. The decision shocked many. Baldwin could barely endure the march. How could he face battle? But the message was clear. This was not a campaign fought at a distance. This was a stand that required visible leadership. Baldwin understood the power of example. His presence at the front would tell every man the same thing. Retreat was not an option. As preparations were made, the army's character changed. Fear remained, but it no longer dominated. Instead, a quiet intensity settled over the ranks. Knights checked weapons in silence. Infantry tightened straps and grips. No one pretended the odds were fair, but fairness had long since ceased to matter. Baldwin was lifted more securely into his saddle, his armor adjusted to protect weakened limbs. Those closest to him could see the strain etched across his face, yet his eyes remained focused. He was not chasing glory, he was fulfilling duty. In that moment, Baldwin embodied a truth history would remember long after names and numbers faded. Leadership is not measured by strength alone, but by willingness to stand where others would fall back. As the army advanced toward the scattered enemy host, the final distance closed rapidly. There would be no second chance, no fallback plan. What followed would determine not only the fate of Jerusalem, but the meaning of Baldwin's reign. The boy who had been given a crown without a future was about to challenge history itself. By the time the sun climbed higher over the open plains, exhaustion had stripped the army down to its essentials. Armor no longer felt like protection, but like weight, dragging men toward the ground. Horses, driven beyond comfort and expectation, breathed heavily as their hooves struck dry earth. Every instinct told the soldiers to slow, to rest, to recover strength. Yet the march continued, guided by a single understanding. Stopping would mean surrendering the advantage they had barely earned. The distance they had covered in such a short time defied ordinary military planning. Routes that usually required days had been crossed in hours. The pace was unsustainable by conventional standards, and many commanders would have called it reckless. But Baldwin understood that what they were attempting was not conventional warfare. This was a race against realization. The moment the enemy comprehended the danger, the opportunity would vanish.
Despite the strain, discipline held. The men did not complain. They conserved energy, speaking little, focused entirely on the movement of the column. Fatigue erased individual concerns, binding the army together through shared effort. There was no room for fear to grow when every step demanded attention. At the heart of the formation, Baldwin endured in silence. The pain he carried was constant, sharp, and impossible to ignore. His condition turned every movement into effort, every jolt into a reminder of his mortality. Yet his resolve did not waver. Those riding near him later recalled that his expression rarely changed. He did not urge the men forward with speeches. His endurance was the message. The king's presence became a stabilizing force. Soldiers drew strength from the simple fact that Baldwin continued to ride. If he could remain upright despite everything working against him, then fatigue alone was no excuse for hesitation. In this way, Baldwin's weakness became a source of strength for those around him. As the army neared the enemy's position, scouts moved quickly and quietly. They returned with increasingly detailed reports. The opposing force was enormous, far larger than the Crusader army, but it remained scattered. Units were spread across the countryside, some resting, others foraging. Supplies lay unguarded. Horses grazed loosely. The signs of overconfidence were everywhere. This information changed the atmosphere. The march was no longer just a desperate gamble. It was a calculated risk. Surprise, if achieved, could compensate for numbers. But surprise required absolute commitment. There would be no waiting, no cautious probing. Once the attack began, it would have to strike with full force. Baldwin gathered his commanders for a brief council. There was no extended debate. Time was too precious. He outlined the plan simply and clearly. The army would attack immediately, before the enemy could form properly. Speed and cohesion would be their greatest weapons. Delay would be fatal. Some commanders hesitated, not because they doubted Baldwin's resolve, but because they understood the scale of what he was proposing. To attack such a force in open ground went against every lesson of medieval warfare. Yet Baldwin did not argue doctrine, he argued reality. Waiting meant defeat. Acting now offered a chance, however slim. The decision was accepted. As the army prepared to advance, a quiet calm settled over the ranks. This was not the excitement of certain victory, nor the panic of despair. It was the stillness that comes when choice has been made and there is no turning back. Weapons were adjusted, formations tightened, signals reviewed. Each man knew his role. Baldwin was brought forward again, secured firmly to his horse. Knights formed around him, not to shield him from danger, but to ensure he remained visible. His presence at the front transformed the moment. The army was not charging for land or wealth. It was charging because its king refused to yield. Across the plain, the opposing army began to notice movement on the horizon. At first, it drew little concern. Small forces had attempted harassment before, only to withdraw when confronted. This, they assumed, was no different. Orders were slow to come. There was no urgency. But as the distance closed, uncertainty crept in. The banners were not those of scouts or raiders. They were the standards of a full force, advancing deliberately and without hesitation. Confusion spread as commanders attempted to interpret what they were seeing. The idea that Jerusalem's army would leave the safety of its walls to attack such a superior force seemed irrational. It was that very irrationality that gave Baldwin his final advantage. By the time the enemy fully grasped the situation, it was too late to respond with order. Units scrambled to regroup, messages crossed paths, commands overlapped and conflicted. The army's size, once its greatest strength, became a hindrance. Coordination lagged behind necessity. Baldwin watched this unfold with measured focus.
He did not mistake confusion for victory. He knew the danger remained immense, but the opening he had sought was there, fragile and fleeting. He raised his head, scanning the terrain, reading the flow of movement. This was the moment his entire plan depended on. The march no one believed possible had done its work. The kingdom that was supposed to retreat had arrived ready to strike. What remained was action.
The moment of decision arrived without ceremony. There were no speeches, no dramatic signals carried on the wind. The army moved because it had to, because hesitation now would undo everything the march had achieved. Baldwin remained at the front, steady despite the strain, his presence anchoring the line as the Crusader force advanced into history. From a distance, the opposing army still appeared overwhelming, its banners stretched across the plain, a visible reminder of sheer scale. Yet closer inspection revealed disorder beneath the appearance of strength. Units were unevenly positioned, formations incomplete, commanders struggling to impose control over troops unprepared for immediate battle. Confidence had delayed caution, and now caution arrived too late. Baldwin understood that this imbalance would not last. Once the enemy reorganized, numbers would assert themselves. The opportunity lay not in defeating the entire army at once, but in striking before cohesion could be restored. Speed, precision, and resolve would determine everything. As the Crusader force advanced, the contrast between the two armies became stark. One moved as a single body, unified by purpose. The other reacted in fragments, responding to danger it had never fully anticipated. Messages were shouted, riders dispatched, orders revised mid-movement. Confusion spread faster than clarity. The charge began not with chaos, but with discipline. Knights lowered their lances in unison, formations tightening as they accelerated across the open ground. Infantry followed with determination, emerging where the terrain allowed, reinforcing the illusion of a force larger than it truly was. The movement was deliberate, controlled, and focused on breaking the enemy's center before resistance could harden. For the opposing commanders, the sight was deeply unsettling. This was not a hesitant probe or symbolic gesture. It was a full commitment. An army they believed cornered had chosen confrontation instead of retreat. For a brief but critical span of time, disbelief slowed reaction. That hesitation mattered. As contact was made, momentum carried the Crusader force forward. The initial clash disrupted already fragile formations, creating gaps that widened under pressure. What should have been an orderly response became fragmented resistance. Units attempted to hold, others pulled back, unsure whether to advance or withdraw. The lack of unified command turned scale into liability. Baldwin remained visible throughout, supported by those nearest him, directing movement where he could. His role was not to strike, but to be seen. In that visibility lay power. Soldiers fighting near him understood the stakes clearly. This was not merely survival, it was purpose made tangible. Across the field, confidence gave way to uncertainty. Reports conflicted. Some claimed reinforcements were arriving, others warned of encirclement. In truth, neither was fully accurate, but perception outweighed fact. Fear thrives on confusion, and confusion had found fertile ground. As resistance weakened in key areas, the psychological balance shifted. The army that believed itself invincible began to doubt. The smaller force, expected to collapse, pressed harder. Each moment of progress reinforced belief on one side and eroded it on the other. Numbers which had seemed decisive at dawn lost their authority as morale fractured. Strength scattered when unity failed. The battlefield became less about size and more about direction. Who was advancing with purpose and who was reacting without clarity?
Baldwin felt the strain of the moment acutely. His body protested every movement, but his focus did not waver. He understood that the outcome would be decided not by endurance alone, but whether momentum could be sustained just a little longer. Victory was not yet secure, but possibility had become reality. As the day unfolded, the opposing army began to withdraw in places, not as a coordinated retreat, but as a series of individual decisions made under pressure. One unit pulling back unsettled the next. The sense of inevitability that had once driven them forward now worked in reverse. The Crusader force pressed on, not recklessly, but relentlessly. They did not need to destroy the entire army, they needed only to break its confidence. Once that was done, numbers could no longer compensate. By mid-afternoon, the transformation was undeniable. What had begun as a measured advance had become a decisive push. The battlefield bore witness to a truth history would repeat again and again. When belief collapses, even the strongest formations can unravel. The day numbers failed was not defined by annihilation, but by realization. An army certain of victory discovered certainty was fragile. A kingdom expected to fall proved that resolve could outweigh calculation. And at the center of it all remained a king who refused to yield, even as his body bore the cost of defiance. The final outcome was now inevitable. By late afternoon, the battlefield had shifted from a contest of numbers to a contest of will. The Crusader force, though smaller, had seized the initiative and never let it go. Every hesitation by the enemy widened gaps. Every falter in command amplified uncertainty. What had begun as a desperate march had transformed into a decisive push that now carried the unmistakable weight of victory. Baldwin remained at the forefront, his presence both symbolic and practical. Soldiers drew courage from seeing their leader endure alongside them, unyielding despite exhaustion. Morale, which had teetered on a knife's edge at dawn, now surged with each successful advance. The tide of battle had turned not through brute strength alone, but through cohesion, discipline, and the relentless application of strategy. By evening, the enemy's formations had fractured entirely. Retreat was no longer an organized maneuver, but a scramble for safety. Each unit acting independently, each attempt at rallying met with chaos. The numbers that once inspired fear had become irrelevant against the force of coordinated action and steadfast determination. Victory, once uncertain, now gleamed on the horizon. Baldwin's role, though physically taxing, had never wavered in importance. His visibility and command had made the difference between a rout and a calculated advance. The army he led had bought more than a battlefield. They had bought time. Time to regroup, to fortify positions, and to prepare for the conflicts that still lay ahead. This was not the end of struggle, but it was proof that courage and leadership could bend fate, if only temporarily, in favor of those willing to act decisively. As night fell, the field was quiet save for the lingering echoes of battle. Soldiers tended to the wounded, fortified positions, and offered prayers of thanks. Baldwin, weary but resolute, surveyed the outcome. He knew that history would remember today differently than the day itself had felt. Numbers alone never dictated the result. Resolve, unity, and the willingness to act at the right moment had written the story instead. The victory was not absolute. Challenges remained, and dangers still lurked beyond the horizon. Yet, for one day, one critical day, a smaller army had defied expectation, and a king's steadfast courage had turned the tide. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, decisive action and unwavering will could change the course of events. And as the fires of the evening flickered across the field, one truth was clear. History had not yet finished its work, but for now, hope endured.